What if the greatest failure of your life was the one thing that saved you? What if a decision that brought you shame and ridicule was the very move that secured your legacy for 1,000 years? How would it feel to be called a fool for an action that would later be seen as an act of pure genius? History is filled with moments like these. We look back at the lives of powerful people, especially queens, and we see their choices as clear and simple. We judge their mistakes harshly. But reality is messy. An action that seems like a disaster in the moment can, with time, reveal itself to be a masterstroke. The path to success is rarely a straight line. Sometimes it's a terrifying leap into the unknown, a choice that everyone around you says is wrong. Here are the stories of 15 queens who made those choices. Their contemporaries called them foolish, weak, or reckless. History, however, tells a very different story. Number 15, did Catherine the Great's betrayal destroy or build Russia? Catherine the Great's personal physician, Dr. John Rogerson, noted that she worked up to 15 hours a day, often starting before 6 a.m. She corresponded directly with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, and even purchased Diderot's entire library when he fell into financial trouble, paying him a salary to be its librarian. Despite being a German princess with no legitimate claim to the Russian throne, she ruled for 34 years, longer than any other female ruler in Russian history. Her coup to overthrow her own husband involved winning over the army with barrels of beer and a personal appeal. When Catherine the Great seized the Russian throne in 1762, it was not a polite transfer of power, it was a coup d'etat. She conspired with the military to overthrow her own husband, Peter III. To everyone at the time, this looked like a monstrous betrayal. It was an act of a power-hungry foreign princess who had no right to the crown. She was German, not Russian. She was a wife, not a ruler. Her husband was the grandson of Peter the Great, the legitimate heir. Her move was seen as a catastrophic mistake that would plunge Russia into civil war and instability. She was defying tradition, religion, and the natural order of things. Her critics, both in Russia and across Europe, predicted her swift downfall. They saw a usurper who had committed the ultimate sin against her husband and her adopted country. The mistake was her sheer audacity. She should have been a dutiful wife, a consort to the emperor. Instead, she took power for herself, an act that was considered unnatural and doomed to fail. But Catherine was playing a much longer game. Her husband, Peter III, was deeply unpopular. He was erratic, childish, and obsessed with his home country of Prussia, Russia's traditional enemy. He insulted the powerful Russian Orthodox Church, alienated the military by forcing them to wear Prussian-style uniforms, and was planning a foolish war against Denmark. The Russian elite were terrified. They saw an emperor who was actively working against the interests of his own empire. Catherine saw this too. She had spent years in the Russian court learning the language, converting to the Orthodox faith, and cultivating powerful allies. She understood Russia in a way her husband never could. Her coup was not just about personal ambition. It was about saving the country from a disastrous leader. The genius of her move was in its execution and its aftermath. She didn't just seize the throne, she immediately legitimized her rule. She presented herself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the defender of Russian tradition and the Orthodox faith. She restored the church's lands and won the loyalty of the clergy. She flattered the military and secured their support. She understood that power in Russia came from the support of the nobility and the army, and she worked tirelessly to keep them on her side. Her supposed mistake, the betrayal of her husband, was actually a surgically precise removal of a threat to the state. Within days, her rule was secure. Her husband was conveniently dead, officially from a bout of colic, though few believed it. What followed was not chaos, but one of the most remarkable reigns in Russian history. Catherine's mistake ushered in Russia's golden age. She expanded the empire's borders, securing the entire north coast of the Black Sea and absorbing much of Poland. These were not just land grabs. They provided Russia with warm water ports, a strategic goal for centuries. She was a champion of the arts and sciences. She founded the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest art collections in the world. She established the first state-funded institution for women's education in Russia, the Smolny Institute. She promoted trade, modernized the administration, and attempted to codify the laws based on Enlightenment principles. She was a deeply flawed person, certainly, but her rule was transformative. The act that was supposed to be her downfall, the audacious coup, was the very thing that allowed her to unleash Russia's potential and cement its status as a major European power. The betrayal was not a mistake. It was the necessary first step. Number 14 was Queen Christina of Sweden's abdication, a failure of duty. Queen Christina of Sweden was crowned at the age of 6. She often dressed in men's clothing and was a skilled horse rider and hunter, scandalizing many in her court. She was fluent in at least 7 languages, including Swedish, German, French, Italian, and Latin. She spent so much money on art, books, and scholars that she nearly bankrupted the Swedish state, bringing the national debt to a staggering level. In 1654, Queen Christina of Sweden did something unthinkable. At the age of 28, at the height of her power, she voluntarily abdicated the throne. Sweden was a major European power, a victor in the 30 Years' War. Christina was intelligent, educated, and respected. To her people and her council, her decision was a baffling and unforgivable mistake. She was abandoning her sacred duty. She was turning her back on her country, her family, and her Protestant faith. Why would anyone give up a throne? The reasons she gave were vague: a desire for peace, a weariness with politics, but to the outside world, it looked like a catastrophic failure of leadership. Her advisors begged her to reconsider. They saw it as an act of immense irresponsibility that would weaken Sweden and create a power vacuum. She was trading a kingdom for what? No one knew. The mistake seemed to be an act of pure selfishness and whim, a betrayal of the legacy her father, the great warrior king Gustavus Adolphus, had died to build. But Christina's abdication was not a whim. It was the culmination of years of personal and intellectual struggle. She was a brilliant and deeply curious individual, fascinated by philosophy, religion, and art in a way that her role as a Protestant queen could not accommodate. She felt trapped by the strictures of Lutheranism and the demands of governance. She famously said, "I would rather be a free woman in Rome than a queen in Sweden." The throne was not a prize to her, it was a cage. She secretly converted to Catholicism, an act that was illegal in Sweden and would have been impossible for a reigning monarch. Her abdication was the only way she could live an authentic life. She was choosing personal freedom and intellectual fulfillment over inherited power. The genius of her decision was that it allowed her to become a different kind of queen. After leaving Sweden, she traveled to Rome, the heart of the Catholic world and a vibrant cultural center. There, she established a new court, not of political power, but of intellectual and artistic influence. She became one of the most important patrons of her time. Her palace was a gathering place for artists, musicians, and thinkers. She founded the Academy of Arcadia, which became a major force in reforming Italian literature and theater. She protected freethinkers and sponsored scientific inquiry at a time when the church was often hostile to it. She became a central figure in European cultural life, a role she could never have played as the ruler of a remote Protestant nation. She didn't just disappear into a life of leisure, she remained a political player, though without a kingdom. She tried to become the queen of Naples and later Poland, though these attempts failed. But her real power was cultural. By giving up her throne, she transformed herself from a national monarch into an international icon. She demonstrated that a woman's influence did not have to be tied to a crown or a country. Her mistake was to reject the traditional definition of power. Her genius was to invent a new one for herself. She traded the cold, hard power of the state for the soft, enduring power of culture. While her successors in Sweden dealt with wars and politics, Christina's legacy was in the music of Scarlatti and Corelli, in the art she collected, and in the ideas she nurtured. She didn't fail as a queen, she simply chose a different kind of kingdom to rule. Number 13 did Eleanor of Aquitaine's rebellion against her husband doom her family. Eleanor of Aquitaine was Queen of France and then Queen of England in her lifetime. She was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Europe for over 60 years. She went on the Second Crusade, leading her own vassals from Aquitaine. She outlived 8 of her 10 children and was imprisoned by her own husband for 16 years. In 1173, Eleanor of Aquitaine made a decision that seemed like political suicide. She supported her sons in a rebellion against her husband, King Henry II of England. This was not just a family squabble, it was high treason. Henry was one of the most powerful and ruthless rulers in Europe. By siding with her sons, Eleanor was tearing her family and her kingdom apart. To observers at the time, this was a terrible mistake. She was a queen consorte. Her duty was to her husband and the stability of the realm. Instead, she was encouraging civil war. Her actions were seen as a betrayal born of jealousy and ambition. When the revolt failed, as it was bound to, Henry had her captured and imprisoned. For the next 16 years, she was moved from castle to castle, a political prisoner with no power and no future. Her mistake seemed to have cost her everything: her freedom, her influence, and her relationship with her husband. But Eleanor's rebellion was a calculated risk, born of decades of frustration. Henry II had taken control of her vast inheritance, the Duchy of Aquitaine, ruling it as his own. He had taken a famous mistress, Rosamund Clifford, and flaunted the affair. He refused to delegate any real power to his and Eleanor's 4 grown sons, leaving them as kings in name only. Eleanor saw her sons being marginalized, and her own power being completely eroded. The rebellion was not just an emotional outburst. It was an attempt to secure a future for her children and to reclaim some of her own authority. She was fighting for her inheritance and the rights of her heirs. The genius of her long game became apparent only after Henry II's death. The 16 years she spent in prison were not wasted. They turned her into a symbol of resistance against Henry's tyranny. Her sons, particularly her favorite, Richard the Lionheart, never forgot her sacrifice. When Henry died in 1189, Richard became king, and his first act was to free his mother. And Eleanor, then in her late 60s, did not retire. She burst back onto the political scene with more power and authority than ever before. She ruled England as regent while Richard was away on the Third Crusade. She governed with skill and wisdom, putting down a rebellion by her own son John and raising the enormous ransom required to free Richard when he was captured on his way home. Her mistake had in the long run cemented her power. It had proven her loyalty to her sons over her unfaithful husband. It had forged an unbreakable bond with Richard, who trusted her implicitly. After Richard's death, she was instrumental in securing the throne for her youngest son, John. Even in her late 70s, she was traveling across the Pyrenees to arrange strategic marriages for her granddaughters. The rebellion that led to her imprisonment was the very act that transformed her from a frustrated queen consort into the powerful matriarch of the Plantagenet dynasty. She had lost a battle in 1173, but she ultimately won the war. Her supposed failure gave her the moral authority and the political capital to rule as a queen in her own right for the last 15 years of her life. Number 12, did Jadwiga of Poland's personal sacrifice create a weakness at the heart of Europe? Jadwiga of Poland was crowned king, not queen, of Poland in 1384 to signify that she was the monarch in her own right, not just a consort. She was only 10 years old at her coronation. She was betrothed in childhood to William of Habsburg, an Austrian prince, a match she apparently favored. To seal her later marriage to Jogaila of Lithuania, he and his entire pagan nation had to agree to convert to Christianity. When Jadwiga became the ruler of Poland, she was faced with an impossible choice. She was deeply in love with and betrothed to a handsome young prince, William of Habsburg, from Austria. A marriage to him would have been a traditional European alliance, linking Poland with the powerful Habsburg dynasty and strengthening its ties to Western Europe. But the Polish nobles had a different plan. They wanted her to marry Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. Lithuania was a large, pagan, and, from the Polish perspective, uncivilized nation to the east. The nobles saw a union with Lithuania as a way to neutralize a long-standing military threat and to create a powerful bloc in Eastern Europe. For Jadwiga, this was a heartbreaking demand. She was being asked to give up her personal happiness for a political strategy. Marrying Jogaila was seen by many, especially in the courts of Western Europe, as a mistake. She was turning her back on a prestigious match with a civilized Catholic prince for a union with a pagan barbarian. It was a personal sacrifice that seemed to weaken Poland's cultural and political ties to the West. But Jadwiga, though young, understood her duty. After much prayer and deliberation, she agreed to the marriage. She broke her engagement to William and in 1386 married Jogaila. This act of personal sacrifice was, in reality, a political move of breathtaking genius. The marriage didn't just end the conflict between Poland and Lithuania. It created one of the most powerful political entities in European history, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. By marrying Jogaila, who was baptized and took the name Ladislaw II Jagiello Jadwiga, brought about the Christianization of the last pagan nation in Europe. This was a massive diplomatic and religious victory. The genius of this mistake unfolded over centuries. The Commonwealth became a huge, multi-ethnic, and relatively tolerant state that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It acted as a bulwark against the expansion of the Teutonic Knights, the Mongol Golden Horde, and later the Ottoman Empire. The union brought together the military might of Lithuania and the cultural and political sophistication of Poland. This new superpower dominated Eastern Europe for over 2 centuries. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where the combined Polish-Lithuanian forces decisively defeated the Teutonic Knights, was a direct result of this union and shifted the balance of power in the region for good. Jadwiga's legacy was not just political. She used her personal wealth to found and restore hospitals and churches. Most importantly, she financed the restoration of the University of Krakow, which became a major center of learning in Europe. Her personal sacrifice, the mistake of choosing a Lithuanian duke over an Austrian prince, was the foundational act of a new European superpower. She understood that her personal happiness was secondary to the security and prosperity of her kingdom. She chose a difficult path that led not to weakness, but to a golden age for Poland and the creation of a unique and powerful state that would shape the history of Eastern Europe for generations. Her personal sorrow was her kingdom's greatest triumph. Number 11 was Maria Theresa's refusal to concede a suicidal act of pride. Maria Theresa of Austria gave birth to 16 children, including 2 future Holy Roman Emperors and the future Queen of France, Marie Antoinette. She was the only female ruler in the 650-year history of the Habsburg dynasty. Upon her ascension, she found the state coffers nearly empty and the army with fewer than 30,000 effective soldiers. She launched a campaign to inoculate the public against smallpox, a disease that had killed several of her own children, by having herself and her own family inoculated first to build public trust. In 1740, Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg lands. She was 23 years old, a woman with no military or political training. Her father, Emperor Charles VI, had spent years securing an agreement called the Pragmatic Sanction, which was supposed to guarantee her succession. But the moment he died, Europe's leaders saw an opportunity. Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded the wealthy province of Silesia. France, Spain, and Bavaria joined in, seeking to carve up the Habsburg Empire for themselves. Every advisor, every general, every foreign diplomat told Maria Theresa the same thing: her situation was hopeless. She should cede Silesia to Prussia and make peace. To continue fighting was a terrible mistake. It was an act of foolish pride that would lead to the complete destruction of her empire and her family's legacy. She was a woman, they argued, and could not possibly lead a war against the combined might of Europe. The logical move was to cut her losses and save what she could, but Maria Theresa refused. In a moment of legendary defiance, she appeared before the Hungarian Diet, holding her infant son Joseph in her arms. She gave a passionate speech, appealing to their honor and loyalty. The Hungarian nobles, who had a long history of resisting Habsburg rule, were so moved that they famously declared they would give their blood and life for their queen. This was the turning point. Her refusal to back down, her mistake of fighting a war everyone said she would lose, was an act of incredible courage that galvanized her people. She was not going to let her inheritance be stolen from her. The genius of her stubbornness was that it completely changed the dynamic of the war. Her enemies had expected a quick and easy victory against a weak young woman. Instead, they found themselves bogged down in a long and costly conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession, which lasted for 8 years. While she ultimately lost Silesia in the final peace treaty, she had saved the rest of her empire. Her refusal to surrender had won her the respect of her subjects and the grudging admiration of her enemies. She had proven that she was a force to be reckoned with. More importantly, the trauma of the war taught her a vital lesson. She realized that the Habsburg state was antiquated and inefficient. So, after the war, she embarked on a series of radical reforms. She centralized the government, reformed the tax system to make nobles and clergy pay their share, and professionalized the army. She created a new military academy and modernized the bureaucracy. She essentially rebuilt the Habsburg state from the ground up, turning it into a modern and resilient power. These reforms would never have happened without the mistake of fighting that initial desperate war. The near disaster forced her to confront the deep weaknesses of her empire and to take the painful steps necessary to fix them. Her stubborn pride was not a weakness, it was the catalyst for the survival and modernization of the Austrian Empire. She lost a province, but in doing so she saved her crown and built a stronger state for her successors. Number 10. Did Queen Nzinga's shifting alliances make her an untrustworthy traitor? Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba was a brilliant military strategist who led her armies in battle well into her 60s. When she first met with the Portuguese governor, he offered her only a cushion on the floor to sit on, while he sat in a chair. To show she was his equal, Nzinga ordered one of her servants to get on all fours, and she sat on the servant's back as if it were a throne for the entire meeting. She ruled for nearly 40 years, successfully resisting Portuguese colonial ambitions for decades. She was a master of espionage, using a network of spies and defectors to gather intelligence on her enemies. For decades, Queen Nzinga fought to protect her kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba in modern-day Angola from the Portuguese slave trade and colonial expansion. Throughout her long reign in the 17th century, she employed a strategy that baffled and frustrated her enemies. She would negotiate peace treaties with the Portuguese, then break them. She would form alliances with them against rival African states, and then ally with those same states against the Portuguese. She even allied with the Dutch when they arrived in the region. To the Portuguese and even to some of her own people, this constant shifting of allegiances looked like a mistake. It made her seem untrustworthy, erratic, and treacherous. A ruler was supposed to have clear allies and clear enemies. Nzinga's fluid, opportunistic diplomacy seemed like a sign of weakness and unreliability. She was seen as a leader who couldn't be trusted, whose word meant nothing. This approach was considered a fundamental error in statecraft, but Nzinga's strategy was not a mistake. It was a masterclass in survival for a smaller power, confronting a larger, technologically superior one. She understood that a permanent alliance with the Portuguese would mean subjugation, and a permanent state of war would mean annihilation. So she refused to play by their rules. Her mistake of being an unreliable ally was, in fact, her greatest weapon. She used diplomacy as a tool of war, and war as a tool of diplomacy. Each treaty she signed was a chance to regroup, rearm, and gather intelligence. Each alliance she made was temporary and designed to achieve a specific short-term goal. She played the Portuguese, the Dutch, and neighboring African groups against each other with breathtaking skill. The genius of this approach was its flexibility. While her enemies were trying to pin her down, she was constantly moving, adapting, and changing her strategy. When the Portuguese were strong, she negotiated. When they were weak or distracted, she attacked. She recognized that the only way to maintain her people's independence was to be permanently unpredictable. This was not treachery, it was asymmetrical warfare adapted to the political landscape. She created a state that was a fusion of her own Mbundu people and Mbangala mercenaries, a powerful military force that could challenge the Portuguese. Her long resistance became a symbol of hope for other African leaders. By the end of her life, she had achieved what seemed impossible. She had not driven the Portuguese from Africa, but she had fought them to a standstill. She died in her 80s, ruling a stable and independent kingdom that the Portuguese were forced to recognize and respect. Her mistake of constant betrayal and shifting alliances was the very strategy that preserved her nation's sovereignty for decades. She understood that in a fight for survival, rigid principles like loyalty to a colonial power were a luxury she could not afford. Her genius was to embrace ambiguity and turn unpredictability into a shield. Number 9 was Empress Theodora's refusal to flee a death sentence for the empire. Empress Theodora of the Byzantine Empire had been an actress and courtesan before marrying the future emperor, Justinian, a background that caused a major scandal and required a change in the law to allow their marriage. During the Nika riots, the city of Constantinople was in flames for 5 days, and much of it, including the original Hagia Sophia, was destroyed. She was a champion of women's rights, passing laws that prohibited forced prostitution, granted women more rights in divorce, and allowed them to own and inherit property. Her influence was so great that in many official documents, Justinian referred to her as his partner in my deliberations. In the year 532, the city of Constantinople erupted in violence. The Nika riots, which began as a protest between rival chariot racing factions, spiraled into a full-blown insurrection against Emperor Justinian. The city was burning. The mob had crowned a new rival emperor. Justinian's top generals and advisors told him it was over. The palace was surrounded. The situation was hopeless. They had a ship ready in the harbor. The only logical move was to flee, to save their lives, and perhaps regroup elsewhere. This day meant certain death. Justinian was convinced. He was ready to run. This was the moment that his wife, Empress Theodora, stepped forward. She refused to leave. To everyone else in the room, this was a fatal mistake. It was a suicidal act of defiance. Her husband, the emperor, was ready to make the sensible choice. Her insistence on staying was seen as an emotional, irrational decision that would get them all killed and hand the empire to the rebels. But Theodora's refusal was based on a profound understanding of power. She stood before her terrified husband and his advisors and delivered one of the most famous speeches in Byzantine history. She argued that, it was better to die as a ruler than to live as an exile. She famously declared, "The royal purple is a noble shroud." Her point was not about a glorious death. It was about the symbolism of the monarchy. If the emperor fled, he would never be seen as a legitimate ruler again. He would be a coward who had abandoned his capital and his people. The only way to save the throne was to risk everything to defend it. Her speech had an electrifying effect. Shamed and inspired by his wife's courage, Justinian resolved to stay and fight. He ordered his loyal general, Belisarius, to take his troops to the hippodrome, where the rioters were gathered. In a brutal and decisive assault, Belisarius and his men crushed the rebellion. Tens of thousands of people were killed, but the riot was over. Justinian's throne was secure. Theodora's mistake of refusing to flee was the single act that saved the Byzantine Empire. The genius of her decision had long-lasting consequences. Had they fled, Justinian's reign would have been a historical footnote. Because they stayed, he went on to rule for nearly 40 more years, a period of incredible achievement. He launched a massive rebuilding program in Constantinople, which included the construction of the magnificent Hagia Sophia that still stands today. He ordered the codification of Roman law into what became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the Justinian Code, which became the foundation for the legal systems of much of modern Europe. He launched military campaigns that temporarily reconquered large parts of the Western Roman Empire, including Italy and North Africa. None of this would have happened if Theodora had agreed to get on that boat. Her supposed mistake, her irrational refusal to accept defeat, was the pivot upon which the future of the empire turned. She understood that sometimes the only way to hold on to power is to refuse to let go, no matter the cost. Number 8, did Queen Ranavalona I's isolationism cripple Madagascar? Ranavalona I of Madagascar ruled for 33 years, a reign marked by a fierce defense of her nation's sovereignty. She came to power after the suspicious death of her husband, Radama I, and immediately purged the court of his family members and allies. She established a form of trial by ordeal using a poison nut from the Tangina tree. Tens of thousands are estimated to have died from this practice. Despite her reputation for brutality, she also oversaw the development of local industries to replace banned European imports, including the production of soap, sugar, and even small-scale firearms. Queen Ranavalona I of Madagascar is often remembered as a cruel and paranoid tyrant. When she came to the throne in 1828, she inherited a kingdom that had been slowly opening up to European influence. Her predecessor had welcomed British missionaries, signed trade deals, and even adopted some European military techniques. Ranavalona reversed this policy completely. She became deeply suspicious of European intentions, believing they were seeking to colonize her island. So, she made a decision that was seen by the outside world as a catastrophic mistake. She chose isolationism. She expelled foreign missionaries, tore up treaties with Britain and France, banned Christianity, and severely restricted foreign trade. To the European powers, this was an act of backward, xenophobic madness. They argued she was crippling her country's economy, cutting it off from modern technology and ideas, and plunging it back into a dark age. Her policies were seen as a paranoid error that would lead to Madagascar's ruin, but Ranavalona's mistake was a calculated and, in many ways, successful strategy of anti-colonial resistance. She was not just being paranoid, she was a shrewd observer of what was happening elsewhere in the world. She saw European powers slowly but surely taking control of other nations under the guise of trade and religion. She believed that letting them get a foothold in Madagascar would be the first step towards colonization. Her isolationism was not about rejecting the modern world entirely, it was about controlling the terms of engagement. She wanted Madagascar to modernize, but on its own terms, using its own resources. The genius of her brutal policy was that it worked. While other nations across Africa and Asia were falling under European control during the 19th century, Madagascar remained independent. Ranavalona forced her country to become self-sufficient. When she banned European imports, she stimulated local industry. Malagasy craftsmen learned to manufacture goods that had previously been imported. She maintained a large, well-drilled army, which successfully repelled several attempts by the British and French to invade or establish a military presence. In 1845, a joint British-French naval force attacked the port of Tamatave, and they were decisively defeated by Ranavalona's army. She had the heads of the defeated European soldiers put on pikes along the shore as a warning. Her reign was undeniably harsh, and many of her own people suffered under her rule. But her mistake of rejecting Europe preserved Malagasy independence for her entire 33-year reign and for decades after her death. The French would not succeed in conquering Madagascar until 1895, long after most of Africa had been carved up by colonial powers. Ranavalona's isolationist policy, seen as so self-destructive by outsiders, was the very thing that bought her country precious decades of sovereignty. She chose self-reliance over foreign dependence, and while the cost was high, it achieved her primary goal, keeping the colonizers out. Her genius was to recognize the threat of colonialism long before many other rulers did, and to take the radical, ruthless steps she felt were necessary to combat it. Number 7, did Queen Anne's quarrel with a friend hand? Power to her enemies. Queen Anne of Great Britain was the last monarch of the Stuart dynasty. She suffered from terrible health her entire life, including gout so severe she sometimes had to be carried to Parliament in a sedan chair. She was pregnant at least 17 times, but not a single one of her children survived to adulthood, creating a massive succession crisis. The Act of Union in 1707, which formally united the kingdoms of England and Scotland into Great Britain, was passed during her reign. 4 years, Queen Anne's closest confidante and most powerful advisor was Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough. Their relationship was incredibly intense. They wrote to each other using pet names, Mrs. Morley for the Queen and Mrs. Freeman for Sarah. Sarah was brilliant, assertive, and a staunch supporter of the Whig Party. Her husband, the Duke of Marlborough, was the Captain General of the Army, a military genius. And together, the Churchills and the Whigs dominated Anne's court and government. But over time, Anne grew tired of Sarah's domineering personality. A new, quieter woman named Abigail Masham, Sarah's own cousin whom she had introduced to court, began to gain the Queen's favor. Anne started confiding in Abigail and drifting away from Sarah. This led to a bitter public falling out between the Queen and the Duchess. In 1711, Anne finally dismissed Sarah from all her court positions and her husband from his command. To the Whigs and many political observers, this was a huge mistake. The Queen was allowing a personal squabble, a petty jealousy manipulated by a lowly bedchamber woman to dictate national policy. She was firing the greatest general of the age in the middle of a major war, the War of the Spanish Succession, and alienating her most experienced politicians. It seemed like a terrible error in judgment, driven by emotion rather than reason, but Anne's decision was much more than a personal tiff. It was a calculated political rebellion. She had come to believe that the Whigs and the Churchills had become too powerful. They were pushing her to continue the war in Spain, a conflict that was becoming increasingly costly in blood and treasure for their own glory and profit. They were trying to force her to accept their choice of ministers and were bullying her in private. The quarrel was Anne's way of reasserting her own authority as the monarch. Abigail Masham was not just a sycophantic friend. She was related to Robert Harley, the leader of the opposition Tory party. By shifting her favor from Sarah to Abigail, Anne was signaling a massive political shift. The genius of this move was that it fundamentally altered the course of British politics. By breaking with the Churchills, Anne was able to bring the Tories into power. The new Tory government, led by Harley, immediately began secret negotiations to end the War of the Spanish Succession. This resulted in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The treaty was highly favorable to Great Britain, securing it significant territorial gains like Gibraltar and Minorca, as well as lucrative trading rights in the Spanish Americas. The war that the Whigs had wanted to prolong was ended on Britain's terms. Anne's mistake of firing her best general had actually led to a successful peace. Furthermore, this episode helped solidify the role of the monarch in a developing two-party system. Anne demonstrated that the sovereign still had the power to hire and fire ministers and to shift the balance of power between the parties. She was not a mere puppet of the dominant faction. Her personal break with Sarah Churchill was the catalyst for a political revolution that ended a costly war and reshaped the British government. It was not an emotional blunder. It was a quiet, determined, and ultimately successful assertion of royal prerogative. Number 6 was Wu Zetian's seizure of the throne, a betrayal of all Chinese tradition. Wu Zetian was the only woman in the entire history of China to rule as emperor in her own right, establishing her own dynasty, the Zhou. She entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a junior concubine at the age of 14. After Taizong's death, she was supposed to live out her days as a Buddhist nun, but she managed to return to the palace and win the favor of the new emperor, his son Gaozong. She is said to have created a secret police force to eliminate her rivals, and accusations of cruelty and ruthlessness followed her throughout her life. In 690, Wu Zetian did the unthinkable in Chinese society. After ruling for years from behind the scenes as empress consort and then as regent for her sons, she deposed her own son, declared the start of a new dynasty, and took the title of emperor for herself. In the deeply patriarchal Confucian society of ancient China, this was more than a mistake, it was an abomination. A woman ruling as emperor was a violation of the cosmic order, an affront to heaven, and a betrayal of thousands of years of tradition. Her critics, and there were many, saw her as a wicked, power-mad usurper who had murdered her way to the top. They predicted that her reign would be an unnatural disaster, bringing chaos and ruin to the Tang dynasty and the empire. Her seizure of the throne was seen as the ultimate act of illegitimate ambition. But Wu Zetian's rule was not the disaster her detractors predicted. In fact, her mistake of seizing the throne ushered in a period of relative stability and prosperity. She was a remarkably capable and intelligent administrator. She understood that her position was precarious and that she needed to govern well to maintain it. She was ruthless with her enemies, particularly the old aristocratic families of the Northwest who despised her, but she was also a skilled politician who knew how to recruit and promote talented people. The genius of her reign lay in the fundamental changes she made to the Chinese bureaucracy. She greatly expanded and reformed the imperial examination system. This system allowed men to be appointed to government positions based on their merit and academic ability rather than their family connections. By doing this, she broke the power of the old, established aristocratic clans, and created a new class of scholar officials who were loyal to her and the state. This mistake of defying the old guard actually made the Chinese government more efficient and less corrupt. It opened up opportunities for talented men from lower-ranking families, which strengthened the state in the long run. She was also a wise ruler in other areas. She promoted Buddhism as a state religion, which helped to unify the culturally diverse empire. She was a patron of art and scholarship. She made sensible economic policies, reducing taxes on peasants and encouraging agriculture. In foreign policy, she was generally successful, expanding the empire's western borders and keeping its enemies at bay. While traditional Confucian historians have often portrayed her as a cruel tyrant, the evidence of her reign suggests she was a highly effective leader. The act that was supposed to be a violation of all that was right and proper in China turned out to be the work of a skilled and competent ruler who governed effectively for 15 years. Her mistake was to believe a woman could rule as well as a man. Her genius was to prove it. Number 5. Did Hatshepsut's male persona weaken the legitimacy of the pharaohs? Hatshepsut's magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is one of the architectural marvels of ancient Egypt. After her death, her successor, Thutmose III, attempted to erase her from history by chiseling her name and image off monuments and temples. For centuries, her reign was almost completely unknown to historians. She ruled for over 20 years, a period of great peace and prosperity for Egypt. Her trading expedition to the land of Punt, likely modern-day Somalia or Eritrea, was a massive success, bringing back gold, incense, myrrh, and live trees. Around 1478 BC, Hatshepsut, the regent for her young stepson, Thutmose III, made a move that was unprecedented in Egyptian history. She declared herself pharaoh. But she didn't just rule as a queen, she took on all the titles and iconography of a male king. In statues and reliefs, she was depicted with a male body, wearing the traditional kilt and the false beard of the pharaohs. To the deeply conservative and tradition-bound society of ancient Egypt, this must have seemed like a shocking mistake. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of the male god Horus. For a woman to take on this role, to portray herself as a man, was a radical break with tradition that risked offending the gods and undermining the very concept of kingship. It was a move that could have been seen as weakening the sacred legitimacy of the throne itself, but Hatshepsut's decision was a brilliant solution to a difficult political problem. She needed to establish her authority in a male-dominated world. Simply ruling as a female regent would have left her vulnerable. By adopting the male persona of a pharaoh, she was using the existing language of power to legitimize her rule. She wasn't trying to change the system, she was cleverly fitting herself into it. She presented herself not as a usurper, but as the chosen successor of her father, Thutmose I, and the earthly incarnation of the gods, just like any male pharaoh. She created a mythology around her divine birth to further cement her claim. The genius of this mistake is evident in the results of her reign. Her 22-year rule was one of the most successful in the history of the New Kingdom, because she was not a traditional warrior king. She did not pursue aggressive military campaigns. Instead, she focused on peace, trade, and building. Her reign was a golden age of prosperity and architectural innovation. She launched a massive building program throughout Egypt, restoring old temples and constructing new ones. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri is a masterpiece that still inspires awe today. She reestablished trade routes that had been disrupted, most famously sending a major expedition to the land of Punt, which brought immense wealth back to Egypt. By choosing to portray herself as a male pharaoh, she was able to command the respect and obedience of the powerful priesthood and bureaucracy. She maintained stability and provided a long period of peace that allowed Egypt to flourish. Her mistake of breaking with gender tradition was the very thing that enabled her to be such an effective and successful ruler. When her stepson Thutmose III finally took the throne after her death, he inherited a strong, wealthy, and stable kingdom, the perfect launching pad for his own illustrious military career. Hatshepsut's genius was to understand that to wield power, she had to adopt its traditional symbols, even if it meant creating a completely new identity for herself. Number 4, did Queen Victoria's long mourning make the monarchy irrelevant? And Queen Victoria survived at least 7 different assassination attempts during her reign. She proposed to her husband, Prince Albert, not the other way around. At 4 feet 11 inches tall, she was a tiny but imposing figure. During her 63-year reign, the British Empire grew to cover nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface, and she ruled over 400 million people. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria was utterly devastated. He was not just her husband, he was her closest advisor and partner in everything. Her grief was profound and all-consuming. She plunged into a deep mourning from which she never truly emerged, wearing black for the remaining 40 years of her life. But more significantly, she withdrew almost completely from public life. For years, she refused to open Parliament, attend ceremonies, or be seen by her people. She became a recluse, the Widow of Windsor. To the press, to politicians, and to much of the public, this was a terrible mistake. The Queen was neglecting her constitutional duties. Her absence was weakening the monarchy. A growing Republican movement argued that if the country could function perfectly well without a visible monarch, then perhaps it didn't need one at all. Her long, self-imposed seclusion was seen as a dangerous dereliction of duty that was making the crown irrelevant and vulnerable. But Victoria's withdrawal, while driven by personal grief, had an unforeseen and genius political consequence. By stepping back from the day-to-day business of government, she accidentally allowed the modern British constitutional monarchy to take shape. In her absence, the power of the Prime Minister and the cabinet grew significantly. The political system learned to operate without the active intervention of the sovereign. The monarchy transitioned from a direct political player into a more symbolic, ceremonial role, a figurehead that stood above the fray of party politics. This transformation was crucial. In an age of revolution and growing democracy across Europe, a politically powerful monarch would have been a target. By becoming a symbol of stability rather than an active ruler, Victoria inadvertently secured the long-term survival of the British monarchy. The other stroke of genius was in the myth-making. Her profound grief, while criticized by politicians, was understood by ordinary people. It humanized her. She became the ultimate grieving widow, a figure of great public sympathy. When she did finally begin to re-emerge for major events like her Golden and Diamond Jubilees, the public response was overwhelming. The long years of absence had created a huge sense of anticipation and affection. She had transformed from a queen into an icon, the grandmother of Europe and the embodiment of the British Empire. Her image as a stoic, moral, and enduring figure became a powerful symbol of Victorian values. Her mistake of retreating from public life had, in the long run, saved and redefined the institution she represented. She allowed the political system to evolve, which protected the monarchy from Republican attacks, and she transformed her own image from that of a working monarch into a revered, almost mythical national symbol. When she died in 1901, the monarchy was arguably more popular and more secure than it had been when she took the throne. Her great personal tragedy turned out to be her greatest political triumph. Number 3, did Cleopatra's alliance with Mark Antony condemn Egypt to ruin? Cleopatra VII was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. She was a direct descendant of Ptolemy I Soter, a general who served under Alexander the Great. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn to speak Egyptian, in addition to her native Greek and at least 7 other languages. She was not just a beautiful seductress, she was a published medical author and a shrewd naval commander. In the chaotic aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra of Egypt made a fateful choice. She allied herself with Mark Antony, one of the 3 men ruling Rome. This alliance was political, military, and deeply personal. Together, they formed a power base in the Eastern Mediterranean, challenging the authority of Antony's rival, Octavian, in Rome. To Roman eyes and to many later historians, this was Cleopatra's greatest mistake. She had backed the wrong horse. Antony was portrayed by Octavian's propaganda as a decadent, drunken fool who had been bewitched by a foreign queen and had gone native. By siding with him against the might of Rome, Cleopatra was seen as leading her ancient kingdom to its doom. Her choice seemed to be a reckless gamble that would inevitably end with Egypt's conquest and the end of its independence. When they were finally defeated at the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, it looked like the critics were right. And her mistake had cost Egypt everything, but viewing this alliance as a simple mistake is to misunderstand Cleopatra's desperate situation. Egypt was no longer a superpower. It was a wealthy but vulnerable kingdom caught in the throes of the Roman civil wars. Independence was already a fiction. The real choice was not between independence and submission, but between which Roman warlord to support. Her father had been a puppet of Rome. Cleopatra knew that Egypt's only chance of survival was to ally with a powerful Roman who could protect it. Her first choice, Julius Caesar, had worked brilliantly. After his death, Antony was the most powerful man in the Eastern world, a proven general with a huge army. Allying with him was not a romantic whim, it was the most logical and strategic choice available to her. The genius of her alliance, even in ultimate defeat, was what it achieved for Egypt in the short term and for her own legacy in the long term. For over a decade, the alliance with Antony kept Egypt safe and prosperous. It was a period of stability. Cleopatra was not Antony's puppet. She was his partner. He gave her back former Egyptian territories, and together they ruled a vast Eastern empire. She was a queen in her own right, a powerful player on the world stage. Her mistake gave Egypt a final, glorious decade of power and influence before the inevitable Roman takeover. Even more significant was the legacy. Octavian won the war, but Cleopatra and Antony won the story. Their tragic love affair, their defiance of Rome, their dramatic end, it all created a legend that has fascinated the world for 2,000 years. Octavian, who became the Emperor Augustus, tried to portray her as a wicked foreign temptress, but in doing so, he made her an immortal figure of romance and power. She became the most famous woman of the ancient world. Her mistake of backing Antony ensured that she would not be remembered as just another client queen who was swallowed by Rome. She would be remembered as the queen who challenged Rome, who captivated two of its greatest men, and who chose to die rather than be paraded in a triumph. Her gamble didn't save her kingdom in the end, but it secured her an eternal legacy that far outshone that of most other, more successful rulers. Number 2, did Isabella I's gamble on Columbus bankrupt her kingdom on a fool's errand? Isabella I of Castile was a devout Catholic who, along with her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, completed the Reconquista, ending nearly 800 years of Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish Inquisition was established under their reign. She was a patron of learning and the arts, and established a large court library. She insisted that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were her subjects and should not be enslaved, a policy that was unfortunately widely ignored. In 1492, after years of being rejected by other European monarchs, an obscure Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus finally convinced Queen Isabella of Castile to finance his voyage. His plan was to sail west to reach the East Indies, a route that most educated people at the time believed was far longer than he calculated. To many of Isabella's advisors, this was a monumental mistake. The Kingdom of Castile was nearly bankrupt after the long and costly war to conquer Granada. To waste precious money on a crackpot theory, a speculative venture with almost no chance of success, seemed like an act of incredible foolishness. The enterprise of the Indies was seen as a fool's errand. Isabella was backing a dreamer with bad math against the advice of her own experts. The mistake was to squander state resources on what was, by all reasonable accounts, a fantasy. But Isabella's decision was not just a blind gamble. It was a calculated risk taken at a moment of great national ambition. With the Reconquista complete, Spain was looking to expand its influence and find new sources of wealth. Their great rival, Portugal, was dominating the lucrative trade routes to the east by sailing around Africa. As Spain needed a way to compete, Columbus's plan, however risky, was the only one on the table that offered a potential shortcut. Isabella's investment was also relatively modest. She was not bankrupting her kingdom. She was funding a small expedition that, if it failed, would be a minor loss, but if it succeeded, could change the world. It was an act of strategic vision, not financial recklessness. The genius of her mistake is one of the defining facts of modern history. Columbus did not reach the Indies, of course. He stumbled upon an entire continent that was unknown to Europeans. The discovery of the Americas transformed Spain from a regional European power into the world's first global superpower. The gold and silver that flowed from the mines of Mexico and Peru funded the Spanish Empire for over a century. It financed their armies, built their palaces and cathedrals, and allowed them to dominate European politics. The world was remade. New trade routes were established, new foods and ideas were exchanged across the Atlantic in the Columbian Exchange, and the map of the world was redrawn. The consequences were complex and often brutal for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, a dark side to this story. But from the perspective of Queen Isabella and the Kingdom of Spain, her decision was an almost unimaginable success. The mistake of funding a crazy sailor resulted in the creation of a vast, wealthy empire that lasted for centuries. It was arguably the single most profitable investment ever made by a monarch. Isabella's genius was her willingness to take a risk on a bold, unconventional idea at a moment when her nation was ready for a new challenge. She chose to look beyond the horizon when all her advisors were looking at the balance sheets. Number one was Elizabeth I's refusal to marry, a betrayal of her duty to England. Queen Elizabeth I of England survived a tumultuous youth, including being imprisoned in the Tower of London by her own half-sister, Queen Mary I. She was a master of propaganda, carefully crafting her image as the Virgin Queen, married only to her kingdom. She spoke 5 languages fluently and was a gifted speechmaker, famously rallying her troops at Tilbury as the Spanish Armada approached. Despite her single status, her 45-year reign, known as the Elizabethan Age, is remembered as a golden era of English culture, with figures like Shakespeare and Marlowe. From the moment she took the throne in 1558, Queen Elizabeth I was pressured by her council, her parliament, and every court in Europe to do one thing merry and produce an heir. For a 16th century monarch, this was their single most important duty. An heir would secure the dynasty and prevent a succession crisis or civil war. Elizabeth had numerous suitors, from Philip II of Spain to the Duke of Anjou from France. Her refusal to choose any of them was seen as her greatest, most dangerous mistake. Her chief advisor, William Cecil, begged her to marry. Parliament petitioned her repeatedly. To everyone, her stubborn refusal to name a husband or a successor was an act of incredible irresponsibility. It was a betrayal of her duty to her people that threatened to plunge England into chaos upon her death. Her failure to marry was the defining political problem of her reign, but Elizabeth's refusal to marry was the single most brilliant political strategy of her entire reign. She turned her single status into her greatest diplomatic weapon. For decades, she dangled the possibility of a royal marriage in front of the major powers of Europe, particularly Spain and France. By keeping them guessing, by engaging in endless courtship negotiations that she never intended to conclude, she played them off against each other. An alliance with England was a huge prize, and as long as she was unmarried, both Spain and France had a reason to stay on friendly terms with her, hoping to win her hand. If she had married a Spaniard, she would have angered the French. If she had married a Frenchman, she would have angered the Spanish. By marrying no one, she kept her options open and England out of costly foreign entanglements. The genius of her mistake also worked on a domestic level. If she had married a foreign prince, there was a risk that England would become a pawn in his country's affairs, a fear that was very real after her sister Mary's unhappy marriage to Philip of Spain. If she had married an English nobleman like her favorite Robert Dudley, it would have created massive jealousy and division among the aristocracy. By staying single, she remained solely in control. There was no king consort to challenge her authority. She was the only center of power. She cultivated a powerful cult of personality as the Virgin Queen, a monarch who was wedded to her nation and her people. This created a powerful bond with her subjects and a sense of national unity. Her refusal to name a successor was also a canny move. As she once said, "While I am alive, I shall be Queen of England. When I am dead, they shall succeed that has the most right." As long as the succession was uncertain, potential claimants had every reason to be loyal to her, The moment she named an heir, that person would have become a rival center of power. By keeping everyone in suspense, she ensured her own security. Her great mistake, her failure to perform the primary duty of a queen, was in fact a 45-year masterclass in diplomacy and political self-preservation. It kept England safe, independent, and stable during one of the most dangerous periods in its history. She prioritized the security of her kingdom over the security of her dynasty, and in doing so, she became one of England's greatest monarchs.